Well, it's lovely to see the auditorium filling up because I think we have something quite special for you. It's a real privilege to introduce David Sellu, who's an honorary consultant surgeon at St. Mark's Hospital. And David is a well-respected colorectal surgeon from West London. In 2013, he was wrongly convicted of gross negligence manslaughter and served a total of 15 months in prison. After a lengthy court battle in November 2016, his conviction was quashed by the Court of Appeal. And the following day, the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, announced that there wouldn't be a retrial. He subsequently attended a GMC hearing, and all charges were found not proven, and he was cleared of any wrongdoing. And in the era that we are, in terms of the politics of healthcare, we, as urologists, as consultants, and as physicians, we have significant concerns about the regulatory framework and how it's organized really to blame and indeed criminalize individual clinicians. And we've seen this not only with David, but with the Bauer-Garber affair as well. And real concerns that if doctors don't find themselves in a safe working environment, they will nonetheless be held responsible for their actions. And this poses significant issues, I think, for some of us around the issue of duty of candor. So it's a great pleasure to welcome David to the stage. He's come along with members of his family as well, and we're delighted that they can join us this morning. David.
Thanks very much, Kieran, for that generous introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here among such an elite group of surgeons, urologists. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Roger Kirby, who, as you know, is a prominent member of this establishment. Roger's been a great friend, but not only that, he's championed the cause that Kieran just been talking about, of tackling the law to make sure that this iniquitous crime, so-called, does not continue to affect people's work in the medical profession. What I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is to talk about how this law affected me personally, but also to point out how you might be affected by this law, and particularly how it will affect the way you practice your profession. I've given this talk at the Royal Society of Medicine, or something similar, so those of you who've listened to this talk, do forgive me, but I think the message that I want to pass on is an important one, so it's well worth repetition. Would the defendant stand up? That defendant was I. The occasion was a packed courtroom in the Old Bailey, the highest criminal court in the land. Just to give you an orientation, the judge sits there, or the judges, if there are. The jury are over there. The prosecutors are here. The audience sits opposite the jury on two levels. The defendant sits facing the judge in a cage, that was me, with two guards, each holding a pair of handcuffs. And this was where I was when I was commanded to stand up. It's as intimidating as it is humiliating. And the judge said to me, David Sellu, for the offense of killing Mr. A, you are sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Wow. That was a pivotal moment in life. As I was taken down into the basement of the Old Bailey, awaiting to go to prison, I looked up into the gallery where my family were sitting. They were wailing, crying, I went down the steps of the Old Bailey, and there I began a journey that Kieran just been talking about, where I was taken to Belmarsh prison. Belmarsh, you'll undoubtedly know, is a Category A prison. This is the prison that houses people who've been terrorists, people who've been guilty of knife and gun crimes, child rapists, and murderers. So that was no doubt a very intimidating situation to be in. The question I get asked frequently is, how did it feel at that particular moment in time when you were given that verdict? Well, needless to say, this was the worst moment of my life. Moreover, patient A was a patient of mine. He'd entrusted his care to me, and not only had I let him down, I'd violated the Hippocratic Oath. Not only did I not save his life, I actually took it away according to the verdict. And I'd violated that principle, primum non nocere, first do no harm. A principle that we're all sworn to as doctors. I expressed sorrow for him and his family. He'd entrusted his care to me, and I'd let him down. It's a pretty awful moment, I'm sure you'll agree, in the life of any doctor. Now, I've emphasized the word killing here. Those are my own emphasis. The reason I say that is that, of course, unlawful killing is a serious crime for which there is a serious sentence. Remember, it wasn't all that long ago in this country when people used to hang for some forms of unlawful killing. The last hanging in the UK was in 1964, which is living memory for most of us in this room. The two people who were killed, one was in Strangeways in Manchester, and one of the last people to die was in Walton Prison in this very city in Liverpool. This law was still on the statute books until about 1998. So this is a serious crime for which there is a serious and severe punishment. It follows, therefore, that for any court to pass this sentence, there must be requirements that should be fulfilled. First of all, the court proceedings should be fair and faultless. A court that passes such a sentence should be beyond reproach. No doubt, the jury who are deliberating should be well informed, should have been informed by the judge, and they should be knowledgeable. They should, of course, be sure of the verdict. This is the legal standard that they should meet. Let me make you an analogy. Suppose you went into hospital. Heaven forbid, you were given a diagnosis of, say, bowel cancer. You would you not expect that the way in which your specimen has been collected and processed is robust? You would expect, would you not, that the person or people giving you that diagnosis of bowel cancer are trained, are knowledgeable and experienced. You would, of course, want them to tell you the pathway to which they reach that diagnosis. In other words, they don't just stand up and say, cancer or not cancer. They would say, well, I looked at the cells and they were anisocytotic, there were mitotic figures, the cells were irregular, and so on. That's the pathway through which I've reached the diagnosis. I've put a couple of question marks in there, and I'll come back to them in just a moment. You would, of course, expect that for a diagnosis of cancer, there would be certainty. It's not just that, well, maybe, maybe not. After all, it's a life-changing diagnosis. Now, two question marks here. You would not would you be happy to know that the people who have made that diagnosis of cancer were actually 12 people chosen at random because they have no knowledge of medicine or pathology, because you don't want that knowledge to impact on their impartial decision-making. That's the way the law works. Would you be happy if you were in an establishment where, by virtue of the color of your skin, you were denied early treatment, say your diagnosis was delayed or not made at all? Now, the reason I say that is because the Crown Prosecution Service, the police, and the courts have been accused of disproportionately targeting people from black and ethnic minority groups in terms of the judging them for gross negligence manslaughter. We now know, for example, that the last 4 people to be sentenced to be convicted of gross negligence manslaughter were all ethnic minority people. This is not simply playing the race card. This is a fact. How did it feel? Well, I intended to do no harm. Like all doctors, I woke up that morning aiming to do the very best I wanted to do for my patient. As things were to prove later on, I did nothing wrong. And yet I was targeted. Even if I'd done something wrong, I don't believe that it was so wrong that it was criminal, and certainly not criminal enough, not wrong enough in my view, to merit going to one of the higher security prisons in the country. This was a pretty hopeless situation to be in. I read the newspaper sometime later when I could, and in one of them, it said, when the verdict was read, he showed no emotion. Well, not surprising. My family and I had been through this process for over 3.5 years. This patient died in 2010. My trial was not until 2013, 3.5 years later. We had been constantly battered by things to do with this case for a whole 3.5 years. By this time, the adrenaline had now completely dried up. This was almost a state of emotional paralysis that I was in. So the fact that I showed no emotion was certainly true. Of course, no outward emotion, but that's not to say that I felt no emotion. Let's just wind back a little bit to see how we got to this stage. Well, I qualified in Manchester, not too far down the road from here, some 45 years ago. Up to this time, I'd had an unblemished career. I worked in Ealing Hospital up until 2012, when I was forced to resign after I was charged with this man's death. Before that, I'd been a senior lecturer in surgery at the then Royal Postgraduate Medical School in Hammersmith in London. It became subsumed into Imperial College in 2000. While I was working at Ealing Hospital, I had practicing privileges at the private Clementine Churchill Hospital in Harrow. It was in 2010, when I was practicing in the Clementine Churchill Hospital, that a colleague asked me to see a patient of his who had had a total knee replacement only 5 days previously, who developed acute abdominal pain. He subsequently died of peritonitis under my care. Time does not allow me to go into the details of this case, and indeed, it's probably not appropriate for the sake of this meeting to really go into these details. What I want to talk about really more are what happened subsequently and how what happened affected me and how it might affect you. Just to say that when something like this happens, there are a number of jeopardies that you go through, the multiple jeopardy pathway that lawyers talk about. First of all, this is a very crowded slide. I don't propose to go into this in any great detail, but just to point out some of the features. There was a hospital investigation, which is an obligation under law. The hospital produced a root cause analysis that they quite quietly hid away and was never seen either at the coroner's court subsequently or at my subsequent trial. In that RCA, there were lots of highlights of failings of the hospital, which unfortunately never saw the light of day. I was also referred to the GMC, as happens in these cases. This was not just a single referral, as I'll talk about in just a moment. I was summoned to appear in front of the GMC no less than 12 times in the course of this case. Then there was a coroner's inquest, which was scheduled to last for a week. The coroner, for reasons unknown to me, had scheduled me to appear on the 4th day of this inquiry, but I was on the podium on the afternoon of the first day. He said he'd suspected manslaughter and therefore felt obliged to halt the inquest and refer me to the police. I then underwent 10 hours of interview under caution in the police station over 3 days, giving evidence of something that had happened over the course of 24 hours. In 10 hours, you can imagine that was a pretty grueling occasion. And then I was called to Harrow police station to be told of the charges. I was told, unbeknown to me, that not only was I going to be charged with manslaughter, but I was also being charged with perjury. Now, the problem with a perjury charge on top of a manslaughter charge is that perjury is a very serious offense in law. The penalties for perjury are just as serious as those of manslaughter. So I had the uphill struggle of defending not only a manslaughter charge, but also a perjury charge. Now, the Crown Prosecution Service know this very well, and they were so determined to win this case that they were going to use every expedient in their hands to charge me with perjury. Now, I've produced here a bit of the transcript of how the perjury charge came about. The coroner's court was a pretty intimidating place. Quick firing questions. The coroner said to me, well, now, we've not discussed the CT scan results for your patients because they showed perforation. Is that right? Now, I just want to, that was how the question was framed. I just want to bring your attention to that word results, CT results. I said, yes, they showed a perforation, which was correct. When was that? And I said, lunchtime. Now, the problem with the way that the law perceived this was that I had said under oath that I'd seen the CT scan pictures rather than the paper results. What I understood from the coroner's question was, have you seen the results? Yes, I'd seen the results because they were printed out and pasted in front of the patient's case notes, and they showed the results of the CT scans. I didn't look at the CT images until much, much later, certainly not at lunchtime, and therefore I was accused of perjury. As you can imagine, this was a pretty unfair sort of accusation. And I was therefore now faced with not only a manslaughter charge, but a perjury charge. Now, if you're sitting in front of the television and the weather forecaster says to you, tomorrow it's going to be sunny, it's going to be 27 degrees, there'll be no rain, and you decide on that basis that you're not going to take your brolly out, you're not really going to be looking at the isobars and the weather maps and so on. This is that sort of scenario. I knew the result of the scan because I'd seen them on paper. I'd not seen the CT images, but but they assumed that I'd said that I'd seen the CT images. So moving on, I then went to Hendon Magistrates Court to be given the official charge. I was put in a cage, and the charges were read to me, and I said not guilty. I did the same again at the Old Bailey. Now, why the Old Bailey? Well, I think the Crown Prosecution Service were certainly determined to make this a showcase trial. I think they were determined to show the medical profession that they could take them on if they really did decide to. The trial lasted for a full 5.5 weeks, and in that time, I was on the podium in that witness box for 3 days. Now, imagine standing in a witness box for 3 days, giving account of things that happened over a 24-hour period. Now, under those circumstances, however exemplary a care you'd given, no doubt, because of all the repetition of the questions and so on, you're going to be pretty sort of intimidated by the sorts of questionings that go on. The jury were out for 3 days. They came back and they said to the judge, "Sorry, my lord, we don't understand what it is that you are asking us to adjudicate on." Such are the complexities of medical cases that there have often been questions as to whether a lay jury is really the correct place, the correct people to make adjudications on complex medical legal matters. The judge said, in paraphrase, "Oh, you are the jury in English law. You are the people who decide whether he's guilty or not. You go back and deliberate. If you say he's guilty, then he's guilty." Now, that, in my view, was pretty shoddy ruling by a senior judge in a senior court, such as the Old Bailey. Of course, armed with that confidence, having adjudicated for 3 days and not reached a verdict, they went back, and 3 hours later they came back and said, "Okay, we've made a decision on one of the charges. We still can't agree on the second charge." He said, "Oh, go back and deliberate. I'll take a majority verdict." So this case was so complex that even the jury were struggling to come up with a verdict. Anyway, they came back an hour later. They cleared me of perjury, and they found me guilty of manslaughter. Now, I went away thinking, gosh, this is really what happened in that cartoon. My lord, we do not understand the charge, but we are sure that he's guilty of it. In my view, that was a perverse judgment in an English court. Trial by press. This is, again, one of the other pervasive issues. The cameras were standing outside the Old Bailey every single day that we walked into court, clicking away. And of course, the press wouldn't want accuracy or truth to stand in the way of a good story. One of the headlines in the papers was, "A private surgeon who abandoned dying patient lied to inquest. I'd just been cleared of perjury," and yet this was what they were prepared to say. Some of the press were actually very racist. Deadly black doctor allowed to continue practicing. And they weren't even correct about who did what operation. The routine knee operation was carried out by a black doctor. Why was my color that relevant in any way in all of this? And in any case, I didn't do the knee operation. So, the press aren't really interested in accuracy as long as they can get the sensation that they're looking for. I was led to the Old Bailey in handcuffs. That van is probably one of the most inhumane ways to transport people today. It's not a van, it's really a prison on wheels. The people who are protected in there are the driver and the prison officers, certainly not the guilty, alleged guilty person. If horses were transported in that way, I think the RSPCA would certainly take their cause. I arrived in prison, and one of the prisoners said to me, well, first of all, the one thing you do when you arrive in prison is you lose your identity. I was no longer David Selou. I was prisoner number A9098DA. That was now going to be my designation for the next 15 months or so. One of the prisoners said to me, when I walked into the cell, "Welcome to LESC, LESC." I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, you live, you eat, you sleep, and you crap all in this one room. That room measured five steps by 5 steps. It's the size of a domestic toilet, clearly designed for one person, but because of severe overcrowding in our prisons today, there was an extra bed and a bunk bed. It's the first time I'd slept on a bunk bed since I was aged about 10. There was a toilet in the middle of the room, so you ate, you lived, and you slept in there. That is against European law. European law forbids human beings living, eating, defecating in the same room, and UK is a signatory to that European law, but it's conveniently flouted every single day in our prisons. Prison, of course, is one of the places for violent criminals. I did not know the criminal histories of the other 2 people that I was sharing a cell with. It transpired later that one of them had committed a gun crime, the other was a child rapist. So that's the environment that I was in. There were days when I was locked up for more than 22 hours a day. Now, the reason that people get locked up for so long is really the equivalent of cancelling an outpatient clinic or cancelling a surgical operating list because of shortage of manpower. When there is a shortage of manpower, all the prison warders do is keep you all locked up because they can't manage they can't manage you all outside of your cells. The United Nations Convention states that locking somebody up for 22 hours or more per day amounts to psychological torture. But I endured that several days in the time that I was in prison. So a pretty harrowing environment. I was racially abused. I was transferred to 3 prisons in 15 months. I changed cells about 16 times. This was a form of punishment. One morning, a prison warder would come up to me and say, A9390DA, you are moving to a new cell today. And I'd say to them, well, where? They say, well, I can't tell you that. I'd then pack all my things in transparent plastic bags, and then 3 hours later, somebody would come and collect me, move me on to a completely different cell. This was, again, not a great experience. At one time, I developed a painful and a swollen left leg. Obviously, because of the environment that I'd been in, I naturally assumed I might have a DVT. It took about a week for me to convince the authorities that something might be wrong. Ultimately, I was taken to the A&E department at the West Suffolk Hospital, paraded in handcuffs. My confidentiality was not respected while I was there because even when I was in that environment, the prison warders would insist on being at my consultations, my examinations, and when I was even having my groin scan, they wanted to be there. At one time, we went into the West Suffolk Hospital, and I said, look, I think I want to go to the toilet. And they said, well, no, we can't let you go in there on your own. We'll have to go in there with you. So you can imagine it kind of gives pulling the chain more than one meaning. But again, this was how things were in prison. I was denied books. I wanted to learn Arabic and to brush up on my French, but I wasn't allowed to have books. The only way my family could send me books was to photocopy pages of books. 3 days, 3 pages per day was what I was allowed. By the time I had the whole book, it was 2 months later, and the cost of it was 10 times more than the original cost of the book itself. I had visits from my family who lived about 3.5 hours away from home, so it was a 7-hour round trip to see me for about 1.25 hours once every month. We have 4 children. They can't all come at the same time because only 3 people are allowed in any one visit. And this was the sort of environment, that we would be in. I wore a bright yellow tabard to say who was the prisoner and who were the visitors. No contacts were allowed, so not a very comfortable environment to be in. There were many encounters in court, in prison. In one of them, a bit later, when I was now nearing the end of my sentence, I was in an open prison when I had my own key to my own cell. And every time I came out, I would lock my cell door, because if you didn't, everything you had in there would be nicked in a moment as soon as you turned your back. And one of the prisoners tapped me on the shoulder one day and he said, "Listen, we're very upset with you, you know. You keep locking your cell door every time you come out." He said, "Look, we're not burglars, we are murderers here." Well, what about my life, if not the content of my prison? But never mind about that. There were other encounters in prison, but time does not allow me to go into the details of those. But as Kieran said, we appealed the sentence when I came out. We won our appeal. The CPS decided not to retry me. I didn't get any compensation for having been wrongly imprisoned. I got no apology, so presumably the duty of candor applies only to doctors and doesn't apply to lawyers. The Crown Prosecution Service decided not to retry. The coroner decided not to resume an inquest. And I presume, for reasons best known to himself, but certainly the meaning of that was that the family didn't really get the answers that they were looking for. Certainly it wasn't me. There were lots of systems errors that were not investigated. And all those systems errors, unfortunately, still remain uncorrected to this day. But the GMC still wanted to have a slice of their own cake. I was summoned, as I say, 12 times for interim order panels. By this time, I'd been prevented from practicing now for 5.5 years. The final fitness to practice hearing took place in Manchester early this year. It went on for 6 weeks. The standard to which the GMC operates, of course, is the civil standard, in other words, the balance of probabilities. They cleared me on all counts, on the same charges that I'd been to prison for in a criminal court. So again, this was a perverse decision, in my view, because if I'd been to prison for something for which the GMC completely cleared me, then I think that was really wrong. As Kieran also pointed out, the GMC has now lost the confidence of the profession, especially in the light of the Gaba case. It's now also been embroiled in accusations of racism, so the GMC is certainly not in a very happy position as we stand. Time's running out, but just to mention briefly that I had dealings with medical bodies. The Royal College of Surgeons, of whom I'd been a fellow for many, many years, were not prepared to offer me pastoral care, neither were the BMA or the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges. I think it's incumbent upon our colleges now to speak for us. because the profession is under attack. And I think unless the profession speaks up as one voice, this pervasive law is going to impact upon the way we practice medicine. Professor Norman Williams did finally speak up, and essentially what he was telling the law to do is to back off. Well, I didn't kill anyone, and yet I've been out of practice for 6 years. My family have all been affected by this law. They put their careers on hold, and we have all been traumatized by this experience. So in summary, doctors do not want to be above the law, but I think that this law really needs a very careful look at. The Williams Review has just been published. There are people who don't believe that this has really gone far enough to address the concerns of the profession. As Lord Leveson said in my case, there have been no winners in this case. Certainly I didn't win, the family didn't win. The law itself has now been tarnished because of the way that they handled this whole case. The medical profession is on edge. We're now all practicing defensively because we're afraid to make mistakes. In the light of what's happened to me, anybody could end up, in court and in prison, even if you've actually done nothing wrong. I'd just like to finish by thanking my wife and family for having stood by me through all of this. It's been a difficult time for all of us. Dr. Jenny Vaughan, who's not here today, but she was one of the people who, together with Roger Kirby and others, formed a group called the Friends of David Selou, who took on the fighting of my case in the Court of Appeal. My legal teams, aside from the one that represented me at my original trial, were absolutely brilliant. The Medical Protection Society has also been of great assistance to me in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Your reaction, ladies and gentlemen, really says it all. This has been a truly inspirational in terms of the way, David, that you've come through this. Moving forward, I think it's incumbent on all of us to engage with the review. Claire Mox is currently looking at the issue of corporate manslaughter, and those of you who have an opinion should really engage with it. David, thank you very much for taking the time and trouble to come and share your experiences with us today.
Okay, thank you.
Urological surgeon in Bournemouth in 2007 and is a visiting professor at Bournemouth University. So Kevin is going to talk to us because he's got a lot of experience in this over the past few years, looking at the issue of adverse events affecting urologists and issues around reliance. Kevin, you're very welcome.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Kieran, for the introduction. Thank you to Baus for the opportunity to come and speak to you. Thank you to David Selou for an extraordinary presentation, and it is an honour to follow on from you, sir. Adverse events, urologists, and resilience. The premise of this talk is that when things go wrong in surgery, it has a profound impact upon us, and that is a problem that we need to do something about. It's not a new problem. René Lariche was one of those frustratingly talented medical polymaths who said something of value about many things. But this is something that he said which was of great value, I think, that every surgeon carries within themselves a small cemetery where from time to time they must go to pray, a place of bitterness and regret, where they must look for an explanation for their failures. I do not know when René Lariche wrote that, but I would guess it would be almost exactly 100 years ago when he would have been in the middle of his career. 30 years ago, the problem was still there. Richard Hayward, a neurosurgeon, Great Ormond Street. There is a time, usually but not always, on becoming a consultant when a surgeon must learn to come to terms with the inadequacies and sometimes downright failures of his or her actions that will be the inevitable companions during a surgical life. And it remains a contemporary problem. Peter Yu is a transplant surgeon at Yale, writing last year, "No other profession that demands elite performance has devoted so little to the well-being of its practitioners." Last year at BAUS, I had the opportunity to share some of the background to the work we've been doing in Bournemouth, and we discussed that surgeons are profoundly affected when things go wrong. We discussed that most of the evidence for that comes from the United States, that most of it mixes surgeons with other medical practitioners, and that nearly all of it conflates errors and complications, a distinction to which we may return. We discussed that there is almost no knowledge, no research knowledge, no data about the impact that adverse events has on the surgeons in the UK. We discussed that what we do in the immediate aftermath of an adverse event is frankly inadequate. At best, it's chaotic. At worst, it is destructive. We discussed that surgeons can be described as the second casualty of a serious adverse event, a term I prefer to second victim. We discussed that there are some unique things about surgeons and surgical practice, and of course, much of what happens in the aftermath of an adverse event is common to all medical practitioners, but part of my thesis is that there are some surgeon-specific things because of what we do, and perhaps because of the kind of people that we are. We discussed that existing support is often inadequate, that it rarely goes beyond support of colleagues and family, and that colleague support, whilst always well-meaning, is not always helpful. And we discussed that there is no knowledge within the surgical profession about whether resilience can be enhanced amongst surgeons. Can we indeed be prepared for those inevitable consequences of the surgical life? Now, those of you who think that I'm straying too much into psychobabble may be sitting there thinking that surgeons are the best of the best. We know what it's like to be up there. We know that sometimes you don't have time to think. You may also be thinking that we are the best of the best with a very particular set of skills honed over a long period of time. You might actually be thinking that surgeons are really quite tough. Now, the whole issue of the surgical personality is a debate which has occupied surgical coffee rooms forever and rumbles on in the published literature. Are surgeons different? Are we different because we've done surgery? Do different people go into surgery? Is that a genuine distinction, or is it illusory? And does it matter anyway? And if we are different, in what ways are we different? And are all of those differences a bad thing, or might some of them be a good thing? Shortly after BAUS last year, Claire Garada published this paper in the Bulletin of the RCS. Claire Garada is a GP, former president of the Royal College of GPs, and she runs the only NHS-funded service for uniquely for doctors to look after doctors with mental health issues called PHP, the Physician Health Programme. And she discusses that 11% of doctors in the UK who are registered with the GMC are surgeons, but only 4.3% of the people that use her service are surgeons. So we are underrepresented when we seek formal support, and she discusses why that might be. Might it be because tough people go into surgery, so when things go wrong, we don't break as easily? Might it be that ordinary people go into surgery, but the excellence of surgical training, the support that we have, and the experience of becoming a surgeon makes us tough? But she concludes that the truth is that we are no tougher, but that we see barriers to seeking support. And as a consequence, we are a minority within a minority when it comes to seeking support when things go wrong. So there is this ongoing dilemma about the surgical stereotype. Are we resilient, stress immune, with effective coping strategies, tough-minded, able to flex and bend the rules when that's appropriate? Or are we in fact second casualties, beaten and bruised by what we do, but poor at seeking help? And it's with this as a background that in Bournemouth a few years ago, we began to think about whether we could look at this question in a way which was perhaps a little more research-based, which would generate genuine data. And as we've heard recurrently over the last few days, it is only by data that we can effect change. So what does the research tell us? But can we most importantly go beyond just describing the problem, important as that may be, and actually do something about it? And so we identified sort of 3 areas that we really wanted to try and say something about. The first we've done the most work on, and we wanted to find out what is the state of play in the UK at the moment among UK surgeons in terms of the impact of adverse events upon us. Does what happens, the type of event, really make a difference to the way that we feel? And does what we are like, either because of our traits or because of our psychological state, make a difference to how we're affected? Once we've described the problem, can we really train each other, or can we be trained to cope better with those rigors of the surgical life? And accepting that there always will be adverse events and therefore always an aftermath, can we do better than what we currently do in terms of immediate support? So 3 main areas of work: a national survey, can we prepare and protect, and what can we do about first aid? And the national survey, when it comes down to it, really sought to establish 4 things. What happened? What was the event? How severe was it? What were the consequences for the patient? What happened to you? Were you investigated? By whom? What was the outcome? Were you sanctioned, and in what way? And then some validated questions about what are you like? What are your personality traits? And then some questions about how are you? What is your state? The National Survey has been open since 2016. It's still open. I really hope that many of you have seen it. I know many of urologists have completed it. And at the end, I will encourage those of you who haven't to take part, because more data is always more valuable. So this is the sorts of things we looked at in the National Survey. The analysis of the data is at an early stage, and one of our PhD students is looking at this at the moment, and we've not previously presented any outcome data from the National Survey. But if we look at the first 700 respondents, we see that surgeons see a clear distinction between an error and a complication, which to me seems kind of obvious, but to the literature up until this point has been completely blurred. And complications, as you might expect, are things that happen because we recognize that they happen, albeit sometimes rarely, whereas errors, surgeons tell us that the predominant contributing factor was because they made a mistake. And that's true across the whole sample, and it's true when we look at the 130 or so urologists who we've had a chance to assess so far. There are, of course, multiple other contributing factors to errors, some of these personal, some of these systems related, and we've heard already so eloquently this morning that it is systems that frequently let our patients down. And so they highlighted there in blue are the things which are higher for those certain conditions, and you'll see that there are multiple other contributing factors when an error occurs. If we turn to how surgeons feel when something goes wrong, then when something goes wrong, surgeons feel really, really bad. And I can't overstate how deeply felt the negative feelings are after an adverse event. And of course, we feel worse when it's worse for the patient. We feel worse when we're investigated. And we are, of course, quite likely to change our practice, and sometimes not in a way which is helpful, because we may become risk adverse or check obsessively or order unnecessary tests when something goes wrong. And that's true across the whole sample. And it's exactly the same for urologists. When we turn to current support, we find, and consistent with what Claire Garada told us, that fewer than half of us talk to anyone about the impact that an adverse event has had upon us. And when we do talk to someone, it is nearly always our colleagues and our family who will always be well-meaning, but often unprepared or unresourced, and that we are appalling at seeking formal support, and urologists perhaps worse than surgeons generally. If we turn then to some validated indices of well-being, burnout is a thing. It's not being mentally ill. It's about feeling exhausted. It's about having a sense of reduced accomplishment. It's about being physically and mentally spent. And it arises from long-term involvement in work situations that are emotionally challenging, which, of course, is surgery. And we heard from John Thornhill at Baus last year about the work he's done about the prevalence of burnout amongst urologists. And surgeons are burnt out, much more so than the general population or by and comparison to other professions. Interestingly, we are generally not mentally ill, and I think this is really important. This is not to identify people who have a mental illness. This is to identify people who are suffering the predictable consequences of what we do. And fascinatingly, we display many of the traits that are part of a post-traumatic stress response. Now, do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying that we have a diagnosis of PTSD, which is a clinical diagnosis. But when we asked about the prevalence of characteristics that go into PTSD, like intrusive thoughts, like flashbacks, like dreams, like avoiding situations which bring an adverse event to mind, then we display those characteristics just as frequently as military personnel who have been in a conflict situation, and much more frequently than the general population. So what are surgeons like? We are severely affected by adverse events, whether complications or errors. That the impact of that adverse event upon us is profound, that we seek support, but not enough. And perhaps most importantly, that we are no tougher. Hard as it may be to believe, we are ordinary people doing an extraordinary job, and because we know how ordinary people respond to stress, surgeons respond just exactly like that. And because we respond like that, we are burnt out, and we display features of PTSD, and that doesn't mean that we are mentally ill. So briefly now, can we prepare? If this is what's going to happen, can we stop it happening? You know, when I was a trainee, people taught me lots of things about how to operate. They even began to teach me things about communication skills, but no one ever said to me, when you are a consultant surgeon, some really, really bad things are going to happen to you. This is predictably how you're going to feel. And these are the ways that you can mitigate that response. And there is evidence for the efficacy of psychological interventions in other professions. There is evidence that resilience can be enhanced. But this has never been done in a surgical workforce. We know that resilience itself is not resilient. It can go up and down, it can be measured, and it can be increased. But it's not been tried in surgeons before. And I'm really pleased to say that earlier this year, we got national HRA approval for a randomized study of whether resilience can be enhanced amongst surgeons using an accepted psychological intervention. I won't bore you too much with the details, except to say that we've used and developed an existing intervention, and we've modified it to be used amongst surgeons in 3 2-hour one-to-one sessions. We're going to randomize people into an intervention group and a waitlisted control. If you are a trainee, if you're a TPD, and you would be interested in being part of this randomized study, then please, please contact me. And finally, can we do things better when something has happened? Is there an effective first aid response? And this is so important. And in the aftermath of Bawagaba, the profession over recent months seems to finally be waking up to the importance of this kind of issue. And I've just taken two things from the BMJ just in the last few weeks. When Liam Brennan, who's president of the Royal College of Anaesthetists, was interviewed in the back of the BMJ, and one of the questions that people are always asked is, what single change would you like to see made to the NHS? His first response is that we would be better at looking after each other. James Titcombe is a patient safety campaigner. He became one when he and his wife suffered the tragedy of their 9-day-old son dying as a result of serious failures in his care at Furness General Hospital, part of the Morecambe Bay NHS Trust. And he's become an eloquent and articulate campaigner for how we as a health service deal with the impact of adverse events. And he was asked, what would be the most important things that we would do better when something goes wrong? And of all the things he could have said about transparency or speed of investigation or not keeping people hanging on, this is what he said was the most important. A clear commitment relating to how healthcare staff will be supported in the aftermath of an adverse event. And if that wasn't important enough across the profession, this is why it's important for us as urologists. These are quotes from consultant urological surgeons about what happened to them when something went badly wrong. I felt and feel very guilty, but I remain disappointed by the lack of support from my employer and how this resonates with what we've heard this morning. I felt I was treated like a criminal first, rather than any duty of care to me as an employee doing his job. It always feels callous to talk about the impact on yourself as a surgeon when you know the family have suffered so much more, but unfortunately, my trust really didn't know how to handle me or the process, and I was not well supported. And what we've heard as we've spoken to people about this is that actually no one has any idea what to do. The trusts certainly don't. They don't know whether you should go on gardening leave, how long for, whether you can come back. Can you come back to operate or just to do clinics? Do you need someone with you? Can you only do paperwork? We know that there are immediately multiple stakeholders who need to get involved. The BMA, your protection society, maybe the college. If you're a trainee, then the deanery. And all those people have something they want from you and something to offer, but no one's coordinating their response. So in the third strand of our work, what we've begun to do is to assemble people who we think have something to say and something to offer, and to get them around the table and to begin to develop what we've called SAFER, Surgical Adverse Event First Aid Response. We know that it won't be adequate for all situations, but I think we're confident that it will be better than the complete vacuum that we have at the moment. And we hope those discussions will begin later this year. We all know that as ordinary people doing an unusual job, that our powers can be laid to waste because of what we do. And we know that it is the gentler influences in life that make our lives worth living. We owe it to each other and to ourselves to make sure that there's still a place for those gentler influences, and we owe it particularly to our patients. I'd like to acknowledge the people in Bournemouth who have worked with me on this work, to the organisations who've supported us and who have funded us, and to the surgeons who have contributed in our survey or in the things they've sent me and the things they've said. The survey is still open. I would really, really like to have more respondents. Please go to our website to complete the survey and encourage colleagues in our specialty and in others to do so. All surgeons, regardless of seniority, are invited to take part. And please, if you have an interest in what I've said, and particularly in being involved in our randomised intervention study, then email me or contact me via the website. I'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much for listening.
Kevin, thank you for your superb presentation. Unfortunately, we've run out of time and we'll need to continue, but I would urge you really to complete the survey. And I know that Kevin is going to be around for a little while if you want to come up to him and share your experience and perhaps ask a few questions. Thank you. So we're shortly going to have a symposium and look forward to it. Thank you.
A break for 30 minutes for refreshment after this session, so thanks very much for staying. This next session is an educational session sponsored by Astellas Oncology. The title is Practical Aspects of Managing Patients with Prostate Cancer, and we're using interactive cases. As we've done in a couple of cases early this morning in consent debate, please use your phones. You simply go into the program area, click on this session and the ability to answer questions, because both Ben and Simon have got a couple of good questions to ask you, and we'd love to see your responses. Hopefully I need little introduction. Ben Chalacom's very well known to all of us as a consultant urological surgeon at Guy's and Tommy's, but we're very pleased to have Simon Crabb with us, who's an expert medical oncologist and associate professor in Southampton University, who's also going to talk to us. We've got 30 minutes, and in that time, we intend to cover very briefly a few comments from myself on active surveillance, and then more in-depth conversations on MRI scanning by Ben, and then management of castrate-resistant metastatic prostate cancer by Simon. And that's the breakout, the overall look for the session for the next 30 minutes. Those are my disclosures. So if I was to say to you, more men die with prostate cancer than from prostate cancer, nobody would be surprised. Except if you looked at the figures, you'd think, surely those figures aren't right, because it's clearer, it's closer to 80% living or being cured, and around 20% are just over dying from. And the reason those figures look wrong is that's data from 1935, over 80 years ago. So this reality's been there for a long time. So for me, one of the biggest advances in my professional lifetime was actually the acceptance that active surveillance of prostate cancer made a difference. And it was only that convinced me, when I hit my 50s, to do PSA testing on myself. Because the reality was we were looking at different diseases between real pussycats at one end and real tigers at the other. And although the critics of active surveillance always stress the undertreatment of a few patients, the reality is in the past we were guilty of overtreating the majority because we were worried about undertreating a small minority. So it's hard to believe that 10 years ago at this very meeting at Baus, the 2008 prostate guideline had just been released and there was uproar in the urological community. There were letters being written from Baus to all the main journals saying this was a ridiculous suggestion that low-risk, low-volume prostate cancer should be treated with active surveillance. And yet by 2014, we were totally on board with the new guideline. By 2017, we'd written really first-class patient information leaflets. And in truth now, most of us have engaged with this. We use some sort of protocol. This is the nice one, but there's good ones from Toronto, Royal Marsden and others. And I think we're much more engaged with our patients now in managing the specific patients with low-risk prostate cancer. But there are still remaining questions. Which protocol? When do you biopsy? When do you rebiopsy? What's the value of PSA kinetics and PSA doubling time? But particularly, this is a useful link for me into Ben's talk, which is going to follow mine, which is looking at the value of MRI, both in the initial diagnosis and in subsequent follow-up. And I'm pleased to see that we're all now very involved with the National Prostate Cancer Audit. And these are the latest data, and apologies you can't easily see it. But the 8% figure you see quite clearly is the number of men with low-risk, low-volume, localized prostate cancer who are getting radical treatment in the UK, which means 92% are not. And the 73% you see in the middle are the percentage of men with high-risk disease who are now getting radical treatment, which is 12% higher than it was 3 years earlier. So we're definitely moving in the right direction. So it's now very much my pleasure to invite my friend and colleague Ben Chalacom to talk to you about the use of multiparametric MRI scan pre-biopsy. Thank you, Ben.
Mark, thank you very much, and thank you for Astellas for inviting me. I think MRI has been a really big change in a lot of our practice over the last few years. Initially, and I famously heard Patrick Walsh once saying there is no role for MRI in the diagnosis of prostate cancer in 2008 in my fellowship. I always remember that. It was initially only used for staging post-biopsy and all the artifact that goes with it. Now pre-biopsy gives much more information. There's a lot of noise out there about 3 Tesla being the only way. I think you get quite a lot of good information from a 1.5 Tesla and a good reading of that. The multi-parametric studies give anatomy, pathology information using the DWI and the ADC. And of course, not only now can you look at the whole prostate, identify specific lesions, you get a very accurate volume measurement, you find other abnormalities. You might find a large middle lobe, stones. We've ironically diagnosed quite a lot of other cancers in the pelvis and outside with our MRI. So they're good things to do, I think, in this situation. But the key thing now is that they enable biopsy targeting. Is there any evidence for that? Well, we've got a lot to be really proud about in the UK. We've got 2 amazing trials that have come out in the last 2 years. The PROMISE trial, which quite clearly showed that multiparametric MRI outperformed trust biopsy as a diagnostic tool, and then really a sort of secondary follow-up trial from earlier this year, and that's Viru and Mark Emberton's group, the PRECISION trial. And that looked at whether MRI-targeted biopsy itself, targeting the needles, could outperform truss. And what they found was, I think, really revealing. They found more high-risk disease. They found less low-risk disease, because we don't want to find lots of low-risk disease. And, of course, they found less complications in terms of the morbidity of the biopsy by doing targeted biopsies. So we can take that on and look at something like this. So we're all familiar with the PIRAD system, Prostate Imaging Reporting and Data System, version 2. And what do we do with this in our 2-week wait clinic? Do we discharge this man? Well, what have I said to you? It's a 64-year-old Caucasian man with a PSA of 4.8. Previously, it was 3.6 a couple of years ago. So the doubling time, if you want, is long. The prostate volume is quite large, 69 cc. And PSA density, that looks pretty low. There's no family history. So please get your phones out, have a look at the app, and tell me whether you, in your unit, today, tomorrow, would still biopsy this patient. Okay. One of the interesting challenges for preparing this talk is we have no idea how the audience were going to vote. But essentially, almost 70% of people wouldn't biopsy that patient, which I think was well within our realms of what we were hoping people would say. Okay, back to the slides, please. Now, this patient, I think, is completely different. This is a man with an obvious lesion on both the T2 and on the DWI. There's enhancement there, so we're going to do a biopsy of that lesion. We may biopsy the rest of the prostate. That's another discussion. And we may target these in different ways. But we're going to biopsy that man. And even if you haven't got a very good MRI scan, you've just got a basic 1.5 machine, it's not that clear, some of them aren't, you can still see here the value of MRI. That lesion could have been missed with a standard trust biopsy. You'd have said no cancer. Whereas here, we know that he has an anterior lesion, and therefore we can tailor our approach. And of course, as an advocate of guys, where we do a lot of transperineal biopsies, we would definitely put this man through a transperineal approach to target that lesion. But can we dispense with biopsy altogether? Now, let me just show you a few cases that might pull you back the other way. This is a 55-year-old. PSA is 19. That's not sounding good. And he's got this MRI here with a DWI showing you a really large, obvious lesion in the left peripheral zone. We got a bit keen at guys here. We started rolling out the PSMA. We're booking the PSMA PET scan for this man because we're thinking radical treatment. Cathcart's warming up the robot. We do a transperineal biopsy, completely negative. Now, no test is 100%. So MRI is good, but it's a test, and it's not 100%. So we've done a follow-up scan, and the lesion has resolved. So it must have been inflammatory. How about if we actually think someone's got a really sort of unpleasant looking, perhaps people calling this now a dirty prostate. The whole of the posterior aspect of the prostate is abnormal there, but the man's got a history of inflammation. Do we dive in there? We decided not to. Same man, 3 months later, same view, same sequence. Now it looks like the cleanest, most beautiful PIRADS 2 lesion or non-lesion prostate you've ever seen. So that can fool you. So are all PIRADS2 safe to observe? Well, I would say at this present time, probably no, not all. You'll never pass the MCQ if you tick all. Family history, ethnicity, significantly high PSA density, or if the patient is anxious and really wants to know and rule out the fact that they have significant prostate cancer. They are all good reasons to put PIRADS2 people towards a biopsy. So what about this person? Now this, I would say again, you could perhaps call this a PIRADS3, but there was no lesion. This is the T2. They've got the ADC and the DWI showing no lesion whatsoever, PSA 5. So we biopsied this man, to our horror, Gleason 9, 7 mils, maximum cancer core length, multiple cores involved bilaterally. So that gives everybody a slight worry when you start talking about discharging people from the pathway without any biopsy at all. But in retrospect, of course, relatively small gland, relatively high density, etc. So I leave you with a couple of questions, a couple of thoughts. Do you need to do a biopsy, do you need to do an MRI prior to a biopsy on all suitable men? I think the National Prostate Cancer Audit from last year had us about 50%. We would do that in my institution on almost everybody now because we're lucky that we have that. In America, of course, they don't. But I think that is really the message I want to get, that is a sensible thing to do. I don't think anybody in this room is going to have a biopsy of their prostate themselves without an MRI scan. But are you happy to discharge men with a PIRADS2 without a biopsy? Well, I would say perhaps not discharge, but you don't need to rush into a biopsy. Perhaps we need to have those men on some sort of follow-up if we're in the least bit suspicious, because there are some occasional unusual things out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Simon Crabb to come and talk to us on challenges in metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. So I'm going to go to the other end of the disease. As an oncologist, this is where I come in, generally speaking. I'm going to talk about potential options for management around people with metastatic disease. Here are some disclosures. So this is data from the STAMPEDE trial. I'm aware that many of you will be very familiar with this, but for those that aren't, this is something of a national treasure. This is a somewhat innovative randomized study that was launched just over a decade ago and has now very recently randomized its 10,000th patient and continues. The rest of the world are envious of this because it's an example of academic collaboration that no other country has managed to achieve. What we do in this study is give everyone conventional therapy, which at the time that it was launched was androgen deprivation alone for people starting palliative hormonal therapy. And as most of you are perfectly well aware, in this country that is almost always with an LHRH analog administered by the GP. And this is data that the STAMPEDE team published a few years ago to show what happened in the control arm. So these are patients receiving androgen deprivation alone. This is before the advent of also giving some of these men chemotherapy. And it shows you what their outcomes are if you have M1 disease, so proper metastatic disease. The trial actually also includes people with lower staging. The entry criteria is around suitability for palliative hormonal therapy. And there are 2 points to make about this. Firstly, the median survival if you have metastatic disease is 42 months, so 3 to 4 years, suggesting that we need better treatment options for these people. Despite the advances that we've seen, and I'll come on and talk about some of those, these men are still dying within a few years. The other thing which I think was probably less predictable and perhaps surprised some people was that the median point to castrate resistance, so the time it took until your PSA started rising, which is normally how progression occurs, or that can be through other methods of detection, and the point at which you needed other treatment happened at a median of 11 months. And so whilst most of us are aware of people that you put onto androgen deprivation and nothing's happened 10 years later, the reality for the majority of men is much quicker. And what it also suggests, or proves, is that the majority of men who you put onto palliative hormonal therapy with metastatic disease are going to spend the majority of their time in a castrate-resistant state. In other words, resistant to systemic androgen deprivation alone. And so the treatment options for that proportion of the disease are going to dominate what you're going to be spending most of your time doing. And the other point is that men are increasingly symptomatic through this phase of the disease. So it has a significant impact on quality of life to become castrate resistant. So I want to ask a question, because this is changing, certainly in my centre, has been doing for some time and is continuing to do so. And to ask an audience which I'm assuming are largely dominated by urologists, at what point do you refer your patients with castrate-resistant disease to an oncologist? And it's always difficult when you frame these questions just to kind of cut out the outliers. So let's assume this is an average patient. Let's imagine someone 72, half a dozen bony metastases, bit of hypertension. He's not running marathons, but he's certainly active, going on holiday once a year. And you have diagnosed him with metastatic disease. So the question with that fairly average patient is, do you refer at the point of diagnosis, or do you do it at the point of castrate resistance, the point of progression? So if you could answer that, I'd be really interested to see what people are doing. That's very interesting. So I think, first of all, I want to make the point here that I don't think there's a right answer to this question. And actually, I'm going to also make the point that I think both answers are wrong. So what's happening in my centre, and I suspect in a lot of centres, is that there are two things that are driving earlier referral of patients when they're being put onto hormonal therapy for metastatic disease. The first actually was the STAMPEDE trial. And urologists have been really important in making that trial work, because they were prepared to send the patients to us when we were running this trial a decade ago, where we were proposing we wanted to do, amongst other things, give them cytotoxic chemotherapy. As a result of that, we've now got level 1 evidence that that extends survival. And so for people fit for chemotherapy, we would offer that to every patient with metastatic disease. That's clearly not all comers. There are some people that are clearly unfit for chemotherapy who we diagnose with this disease. But the majority should at least be considered through the MDT, and a significant proportion should be referred. Those two things together have meant that my clinic has changed dramatically. When I started as a medical oncologist, one of my colleagues did a bit of prostate cancer. We now have 3 medical oncologists and 1 clinical oncologist in one centre to manage all of this work, because of the influx of patients, largely at the point of diagnosis. But I would make the point that this shouldn't be a transition of care from urology to oncology, and it shouldn't be about holding them in urology and not sending them forward. We need joint clinics for these patients. This is a complex disease. It needs drug treatments at some points, but it also needs urological intervention. It also needs a dedicated CNS if you're lucky enough to have one. And we're blessed that we have 2 dedicated prostate cancer CNSs. I'm very well aware that in many centres that's a very long way from reality. If you really want to get fancy, then we can start talking about geriatric and palliative care input. But this should be joint care. We should have joint clinics, in my opinion. But I accept for many of us that's a very difficult thing to set up. The point, therefore, should be that we should discuss, we should collaborate, and we should be treating these people together, at least in my opinion. I'll be interested to see what people have to say, perhaps in questions. So I'm going to move on to a case. There's another question coming in a couple of slides' time, and we will record whether you gave the right answer or not. So this is a 64-year-old man who presented to a centre a few miles away from my own. He had urinary symptoms. He was very fit and well, although had an MI from which he'd had an excellent recovery a few years in the past and was on some relevant medication for that. And he was sent up to the urology clinic, was found to have a PSA of 12 and an abnormal rectal examination. Trust biopsies found a Gleason 9 cancer, and this was 4.5 with vascular invasion. We confirmed what the local centre had said, that there weren't any small cell or neuroendocrine elements within the pathology, which is an important distinction to make, although not actually that common. The MRI at that point staged him as T2C with no metastatic disease. The prostatectomy that he subsequently elected for, however, the findings were significantly different to what had been anticipated. And I think in that sense, the first point at which this man starts to behave in a rather concerning way, in addition to his Gleason score. The tumour was found to be fixed to the rectum, and the final pathology showed seminal vesicle and extraprostatic spread. Sadly, he had a swift biochemical progression. His nadir for PSA only reached 7 and soon rose, and he was re-imaged. At this point, there was pelvic lymphadenopathy and 3 bony metastases on MRI, and even in hindsight, these weren't visible on the preoperative imaging. So he was commenced on androgen deprivation with gozarelin. He was also given bicalutamide. I have to say, not something I do personally in my practice. I think it's probably a drug that has had its day other than for flare control. However, by 4 months, his PSA was already starting to rise, although he was completely well. And he was referred to me for what was requested as further palliative systemic therapy. He was clinically well, but was developing some hip pain, and I thought his performance status by this point was 1. For those of you not familiar with this scoring, 0 is completely asymptomatic and well, 5 is dead, and 1 means you're starting to become symptomatic, but you're fully functional and managing most activities of daily living. So I stopped his bicalutamide, which was clearly not contributing. Very occasionally with bicalutamide, it is possible to induce an androgen receptor mutation, which starts to see the drug as a ligand and actually drives a signaling through the androgen receptor. It's not common, and generally in people that have had the drug for long periods of time, but even so, if the PSA is rising, it's not working, so it's reasonable to stop it. So my second question is, what treatment options would you propose for this man? And I think we can accept that there may be choices to be made here, and actually I would strongly advocate that a choice should be offered. But he's asking you what you think he should do. So we're going to pick one each if that's okay. And your options are here: observation, dexamethasone, abiraterone, enzalutamide, chemotherapy using docetaxel, radium-223, which is a radiopharmaceutical, or some other option. So could I ask you to vote?
Simon, you have a little more time, but you are getting a bit behind, just to warn you. Thanks.
Okay, that's interesting. What people have gone for here are the 3, 4, and 5, clearly less for 4. And these are the options that I would say, first of all, are licensed. Secondly, have evidence of a survival advantage in a well-conducted randomized trial. And I think each of 3, 4, or 5 are reasonable options. I would say that enzalutamide and abiraterone, which we'll come on to, are probably largely interchangeable in terms of efficacy, but they do have differences in terms of toxicity profile. Radium-223, I think, is, although a potential option here, probably not the optimal one. The reason is that he has nodes which are starting to progress. Radium won't touch that. It will nicely treat the bone metastases, but I think probably it's a poor choice for that reason. I would agree the others are not reasonable options. Can we move back to the slides, please? So these are the options for treating castrate-resistant prostate cancer in terms of the things where there is a proven survival advantage. All of them, except the last one, Sipuleucel T, which is an autologous immunotherapy, are available and funded within the NHS. And we use these each routinely currently. The differences are the nature of the treatment options. So chemotherapy with docetaxel or cabazitaxel, hormonal therapy with abiraterone or enzalutamide, Radium-223 is a radiopharmaceutical which is useful for treating people with bone-only metastatic disease and is a good option for that, but not good for visceral metastases. And each of these has a survival advantage. It's modest. There is also a quality of life benefit established for those that are indicated. The hormonal therapy options came from 4 randomized phase 3 trials. These are the 2 where in patients who had not had chemotherapy. We shouldn't make cross-trial comparisons, and I would say, in my mind, actually, in terms of efficacy, they are interchangeable. There are significant cross-resistance rates, so generally patients are going to get one or the other. We don't use them in sequence, and they're not funded to be used in that way. The differences are primarily in terms of the potential toxicity. Enzalutamide can cause some fatigue. It also can cause some drug interactions. It's a CYP3A4 inducer. Abiraterone can cause transaminitis and needs regular LFT monitoring, initially every 2 weeks, and also requires prednisolone to stop feedback loops causing mineralocorticoid excess, and so has an additional potential risk in terms of bone health. And the final thing I wanted to touch on was where we go in trying to be more intelligent about who we treat. Unfortunately, we are largely having to treat all comers with both these hormonal therapy options and also chemotherapy and radium, because we don't have a way of understanding who is likely to benefit. We have seen this data in the last few years. This was looking at blood-based biomarkers. We know that in a proportion of patients, the androgen receptor becomes deranged in prostate cancer, and that we induce this by the treatments that we use, particularly hormonal therapies. One of the key examples is this structural variant of the androgen receptor termed V7, where effectively the C-terminal of the receptor has been hacked off. What that causes, however, is a constitutively active androgen receptor that doesn't need ligand, androgen, to bind, and also cannot bind drugs like enzalutamide. And so androgen depletion, whether it's abiraterone or initial hormonal therapy, or an androgen receptor antagonist, are useless in the face of this receptor. And this data was enticing because what it suggested was that you could detect this in blood. And what they also found in this modest-sized study was that patients who expressed this V7 structural variant were almost entirely resistant to either abiraterone or enzalutamide, shown here with the brown bars that go up, which is PSA rising, compared to people that only expressed wild-type receptor, where the majority in grey go down, in other words, response to treatment. This suggested that we had a potential for a blood test to determine who should have hormonal therapy. There are 2 main problems that have emerged since. Firstly, it's very clear that V7 is a poor prognostic marker, so these people probably do badly no matter what you do. And secondly, the structural variants of the androgen receptor are far more complex than this simple change. There are point mutations, there are other structural variants, and it's probably more about the balance of expression alongside the wild-type receptor rather than whether you are one or the other, and also the heterogeneity through the tumor, and it probably varies between different metastases. So an initial lead that has unfortunately become significantly more complex, but I think this is the way we need to go in terms of understanding the biology better. I think that's my last slide, so I will stop there.
Thanks. We did start 5 or 6 minutes late, so I think we've got time for 1 or possibly 2 questions, if anybody's got a question on any of the microphones. One comment I'd have to both of you is clearly manpower, workforce needs to expand. I mean, whether we're following up active surveillance or people with PSAs or referring them into oncology. Ben and Simon, quick comment on nursing involvement?
Yeah, we're very lucky. We have 5 prostate cancer nurses and 14 nurse specialists, but it's still not enough. They run a lot of our biopsies, our follow-up clinics, our surveillance clinics, and I think we are, as a group, need to use this resource because they are excellent, and we are hugely dependent on maximising that in their help.
Simon?
I mean, likewise, I think we've got 5 prostate nurses, 2 specifically doing advanced disease in a team that's much larger for urology. and we know that we are in a better position than many other centres. We also have data to show that these people are seeing twice as many patients as they should do. So we're behind, and other people are even more behind.
Right.
That's the way it needs to go.
Thanks, Simon. Quick
James
question
Bruin, I'm a benign neurologist at Salisbury Hospital. I was wondering a question about active surveillance. So we're becoming increasingly good at selecting active surveillance with template biopsy, MRI scans. So we have fewer patients falling off. I just wondered how you follow up your active surveillance patients now.
Ben?
Yeah, James, you've always been lovely and very benign. But you're also very much a diagnostic cog in your whole 2-week pathway. And this every year we get more and more people, and the cohort of people you're following up gets more and more. So I think if you have a negative follow-up biopsy, you're actually defined as very low-risk active surveillance, which is different to standard active surveillance, which is probably different to the men who make a decision with low-volume 3+4, who are probably high-risk active surveillance. And you have to have a pathway that suits all of those. So we have a consultant active surveillance clinic and a nurse-led clinic, and they run in parallel. And basically the nurses see the lower risk and the consultants the higher risk. But we do MRIs on most men every 1 or 2 years, and we tended to favour that much more now than doing repeat biopsies, which we do relatively rarely after the first confirmatory biopsy.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I feel the takeaway message from me, from Ben, is very much we should be offering MRI pre-biopsy to all patients who are suitable for subsequent radical therapy, that we're not yet good enough with MRI to actually discharge people, but we could delay or use biopsies in a different way. I think what I've learned from Simon is we've got to work much more cooperatively between medical oncology and neurology. And the big surprise is that we're now seeing patients with more time in the castrate-resistant phase of their disease than they were in their first hormone-sensitive part of their disease. So I'd like to finish by thanking Astellas for making this possible. Thank you all for coming here, and we've now got a short break before the next sessions. Thank you very much.